Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Shayne, or good evening, Shayne, rather.
Hi.
How are you this evening?
How are you? I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely our pleasure, Shayne. We'll just give it another quick minute and we will get started. Oh, we will. Firstly, Shayne, just wanted to check, do you have a hard stop at 5:30 or you can extend it by a few more minutes?
No, we can extend it by a bit. That's fine.
Oh, that's music to our ears. That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, shall we get started?
Sure.
Yeah, let's.
It's 5:15. Shayne, I just wanted to show you my Clouded ANZ t-shirt.
Great.
So a very, very warm welcome and a good evening to all of you, fellow Toastmasters, our esteemed judges, and our special guests. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure for us today to have amongst us the CEO of ANZ Bank, Mr. Shayne Elliott. I can tell you one thing, look at today's date, it's 5/10/20. It is going to be double the fun, it's going to be double the excitement.
Right.
And it's definitely double the amount of nervousness for me, I can say that for sure. Without further ado, I now request Neil Dettis to please come over, and who's our contest chair for the day, to come over and introduce the club to Shayne and introduce Shayne to all of us. Although Shayne doesn't need an introduction, but it will still be great to hear.
I guess he doesn't either. Thank you very much, Sanju. Yes, Shayne, I just thought to take a quick opportunity to provide a rundown of our club. It started 31 years ago, and today is our 721st club meeting. So we've been around for a while. Now, ANZ Melbourne's got a couple of Toasties clubs. One's for internal staff only, and then there's ours, which openly welcomes visitors and members of the public. The ideal mix is 50% ANZers and 50% public. Now, to me, this makes us unique because we get to use the fabulous facilities provided by the ANZ. Well, we would if we weren't in lockdown, of course. Whilst we get to experience a wide range of views expressed with passion from many demographics. This helps us all learn and grow. For the ANZ, our club represents an opportunity to not only grow and develop its own personnel, but also to give back to the wider community by helping individuals out there learn, grow, and become more confident in their own selves, and that's ultimately contributing more to society in general. Now, folks, tonight we're privileged to welcome a very special guest to our very special meeting. Shayne Elliott is the CEO of ANZ and therefore our very generous host. He has a wealth of experience in public speaking and leadership, and it's our enormous pleasure to have him attend this evening and share some of his insights with us. So could you please put your hands together, or as we do virtually, wave them around madly so his screen visually explodes with movement for Shayne. Over to you, Shayne. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, and thanks for having me. Actually, it was an interesting observation about the 5/10/20. It's on about today or thereabouts. It's actually 5 years since I was announced as the new CEO of ANZ. So I started 5 years ago in January, but it was in October that it was actually announced. So it's actually my 5th birthday almost in the job. What I wanted to do, something that I was given a little bit of a preview about, perhaps what you wanted to talk about, was leading through, challenging times or a crisis. And I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time on that, and then happy to answer any questions. The first observation before I get into that, actually, it is 5 years since I've been CEO, and I've never been a CEO before, certainly not of a publicly listed group. I've led teams and I've led divisions and countries and things like that. But there is a slight difference when you are the chief executive of a group. And there is a slightly different stakeholder group that you are responsible to. And your communications, therefore, are much broader. So, for example, it's only really as the CEO of a public company that you really have a role in driving the communication strategy with your shareholders, for example, as opposed to maybe just thinking about your staff and customers. So you've got this other group, shareholders. And then the other stakeholder group, which I think becomes far more prevalent when you're in a role like this, is around the sort of regulatory political class, which you may have some responsibility or involvement in different parts of the bank, but when you're a chief executive, that sort of takes it a much higher balance. And then finally, probably the one that is certainly not on your job description, or wasn't on mine, but actually becomes really, and it depends on the way that you want to be the CEO and the sort of things that you want to achieve, is the broader community. And I guess that's really sort of the segue into thinking about leading through a time of challenge and crisis. Many of you will have managed teams or small groups or businesses and others, and you may well have been on some sort of management development program or read some material about management. And what all that sort of literature will tell you is, well, you know, your management style needs to be situational. And it's the same thing for communication. It needs to be situational. What's the environment that I'm dealing in? What's the receptive sort of the audience that I'm talking to? And what are those sort of pressures and stresses and strains that are happening out there at the time? And again, when we think about management style, there are many extremes. At one extreme, you can have a very sort of controlling, directive management, telling people what to do, all the way through to a much more sort of delegated, empowering management style and a coaching style, which sets objectives and lets people do what they need to do. Well, it's the same thing in communication. And what we know is that actually, while it doesn't get a lot of great press or a lot of favor, people are very judgmental about those styles. Each one of the styles along that spectrum is actually the right style, depending on the circumstance. And actually what we know is that in a time of crisis, that directive style works. And it's the same for communication. Why? Because in a challenging time, people are being overwhelmed with information. And if we just think about the COVID crisis, everybody, whether you're a shareholder, whether you're an employee, whether you're a member of the community, whether you're a regulator or politician or whatever, you're just being bombarded with information. You're being bombarded with data, you're being bombarded with opinions, you're being bombarded with views, different perspectives, and it can be extremely overwhelming. And so what people crave or what people want in a time of that is direction. So literally at an extreme, when you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed, what people really want is just tell me what to do. Now that might be quite specific. Should I take a loan deferral or should I not? You know, I've got multiple choices of a product here. Which is the right one for me? Tell me what to do, etc. Or it might be give me directions, but narrow my choices. So I don't want 30 choices, but I'm happy with 2. But in any way, that's what happens in a crisis. People are overwhelmed, they feel stressed, they want help in narrowing down decisions. And therefore your communication style actually has to shift towards that sort of desire, if you will. So really early on in this crisis, what we did is we sat, and I'm talking about in March when this all sort of first really eventuated here in Australia anyway, we sat down and said, look, clearly there's going to be a much stronger desire for direction. And what we need to do is give people a framework for a way of thinking and give people greater direction. So we came up with our 4-point plan, which was around protect, adapt, engage, prepare, which said this is going to organize the way we do the work. And the good thing about that, it's 4 points. Anybody can remember it. They're simple concepts and people sort of latched onto that. What I learned in that period of, while I used it to give a framework for communication and organizing work and deciding who was doing what, it actually evolved into something much bigger than I thought about. And even to this point today, and we're 7 months into this point, it's still a designing principle for a lot of what we do within ANZ. And so I think that again shows you the power of something that's simple, easy to communicate, and actually structured. And then if you think about it, it's very directive. Tell me what to do. Well, we want you to protect your colleagues, protect your customers, protect our balance sheet. We need you to adapt to the new way of working from home, whatever that might be. We need you to engage more, i.e., because again, that's specifically this point. At a time like this, our stakeholders want more engagement. They want it of a certain style. They don't want to continue to be overwhelmed, but we need to engage more. So our customers look for us for that advice, our people, our regulators, etc. So we need engagement, and we can't just be focused on the here and now and the sort of general sort of managing the crisis. We used to use this time to prepare for the future. And if you think about it, there's some sort of logical sequence to those things. Of course, your first instinct is to protect. It's human nature. We're under threat, which is what this is. There's a threat. What do? You protect yourself. You know, and at the end, it's only once you've protected yourself, once you've adapted to that new world and I've understood what's going on and I'm sort of engaging and getting information, feedback, I can prepare for the future. And the other great thing, just before I finish up on that, the other thing that I noticed in that structure and why it works quite well, in my view, is not only is it directive, tell me what's important, it allows me to allocate priorities to different people. So some people were focused on protect, other people were focused on adapt, for example. It also is a way of giving people that direction with a little bit of hope. And I saying to them, you know, the hidden message in there is, hey, it's not all about protect. It's not all about panic. It's not all about hunkering down. There is actually opportunity here, because the other thing that people want in a time of challenge and crisis is hope. You know? So give me hope for the future. Tell me it's going to be okay, and tell me that you have a way forward and a plan that actually can see us do well, thrive, benefit, whatever words you want to, whatever you use. And so that was really, I think, the lesson of COVID. And then just one last point. You know, I think, you know, banks, and I know not all of you work in banking, particularly the people from outside ANZ. What's interesting about banking as opposed to many other industries, and I've only ever worked in a bank or there, you know, or financial services companies, is actually banks go through crises all the time, and it's what we do. And actually, you know, sometimes they're really, really big, like this crisis or the GFC, and sometimes they're small. But the nature of banking is that, and actually history says that every 7 odd years around the world, there's some sort of financial crisis happening. You know, in my lifetime, I started work in the 1987 market crash. I lived through the early 90s recessions that were quite devastating in Australia and New Zealand. We had the tech wrecks of the late 90s, the Latin American debt crisis. We had the Asia financial crisis. We had the global financial crisis. You know, these are just periods of extreme change. And again, it goes back to that old idea, whenever there's extreme change, and that's what a crisis is, extreme periods of change, yes, there are opportunities. And being able to communicate that sense of hope and positivity to our people and our customers is reassuring. It's going to be okay. Yes, there's going to be pain. Yes, it's not going to be pleasant, but there is a path out of this if we are focused, really clear about what's important to ourselves. You know, what's our sense of going back to those core values and sense of purpose as a company, that there will actually be a positive way forward, and to remind people that, you know, we've been prepared for this, and that's why we've been you know, strengthening our balance sheet, you know, simplifying the bank, etc., running BCP plans and all those other things, and giving people confidence that actually this will pass. The world will be different in the future, but we'll be a better bank for it. So anyway, I might time ticks by pretty quickly, but I might just leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions about any of that or anything else that any of you would like to discuss.
Thank you so much. Oh yes, that's literally become our virtual Zoom.
Yeah, fair enough.
Applause, Shayne. As you would realize, you know, Toastmasters is all about public speaking.
Yes.
There are a lot of speeches that we, at least we think we do a good job giving the speeches. So these days, this is the only way we get the encouragement.
Yes.
So there are a few questions, and firstly,
Okay.
Shayne, thanks so much for the extra time that you can spend with us. We will take as much as you give us, so
Sure.
please feel free to
Yeah.
stop us if you have a hard stop.
Yep.
There are a few questions that have come in. First and foremost, what has come up is, what do you see as one of your most challenging or most memorable public speaking a speech that you've made, or rather a public speaking you did?
So just a little bit of a background first. So I would describe myself as actually quite a shy person. So I'm not an extrovert in any way, and I don't seek out sort of public appearances in the normal course of business. So it's not my normal space to be. However, it's sort of something that I've had to learn to do over long periods of time and develop. And I'm very conscious of the fact that it's an integral part of what you do. And in fact, if you want to be any sort of leader, you can't avoid it. Communication is critically important part of the job. And so, and what I keep reminding my daughter, who's 15, who hates any sort of public speaking, this is no different than going to the gym. You can get better at something. It is about training, and is it about the experiences that you have and you learn. And as long as you're prepared to put in the work and you're prepared to learn and observe and take feedback, you will improve. I would say that the most sort of seminal, maybe not totally, but some of the big speeches in my time publicly, probably my very first results announcement when I was first CFO. So that was 8 years ago. So I was running the institutional bank at ANZ. Again, you don't really get a lot of, you do staff town halls and things like that, which are inherently easier because you generally have a friendly audience. And there's some sort of uniformity about the audience. There's sort of, I'm not saying they're all the same, but they all work at the bank. And so there's some sort of common language, for example. Going in to be CFO, and one of the big chunks of the CFO's responsibility is communicating with the market. And you do so obviously through various channels, but one of them being the results presentation. And I decided, because I was not a traditional CFO, I don't have an accounting degree. I wanted, and my predecessor, who was very strong and sort of an accounting person, I wanted to communicate change. And so I wanted to do that in a very different way, not use the same slides, not use the same style. So I was much more conscious and planning about how I would, as much as the content, but how I would communicate that this is going to be different. And so I did that 8 years ago. I think that went pretty well. Just a funny story though, I sort of got thrown a curveball by unintentionally by my boss, Mike, at the time. The traditional way of doing things was you would sit behind a podium, like a desk, and he would get up to a lectern and say his bit, sit down, then I would get up and do my bit. And that had always been thus. It had always been that way. So I prepared for that. And one of the ways I decided to communicate change was that I wasn't going to read my speech, that I was going to memorize it. And, you have to speak for 20 minutes or thereabouts as CFO, so it's not easy. You had slides. So I, rehearsed, and I thought this will be, at the last minute, literally the night before we go in to do this thing, Mike changes his mind and says, we're not going to do that format. We're going to completely change the format. And it's going, anyway, without going into all the details, we don't have time. He completely changed everything through me. I had to go back to a completely different style at the last minute. I didn't sleep very well that night, but I got there in the end. But I sort of stuck back to those principles of I was trying to communicate change. And my test was a simple one, which was if somebody was watching the presentation, but the volume was turned off, what would they note about my presentation? Yeah. And recognizing that a lot of what is about the content, but a lot of it is about the style. And so that was probably the biggest single speech sort of publicly that I've had to do. Yeah. And then the other one would be, wasn't really a speech, but it was an interview on the stage where I had to speak, which was at the CyBoss event, which is a big payments and cash management global industry with thousands of people come. This a couple of years ago in Sydney. And again, I'm not an expert in that field, but I was the sort of openings item, I guess. And that was in this massive auditorium and you're being filmed, and it was quite stressful because, those sense of audiences going back tend to be quite technical. And so they're all experts at what they do. And I'm not. And so and I think again the lesson there was making sure that you're authentic and don't try to be something that you're not. So how do you able to communicate and give some value to that audience, but in an authentic way, and not try to, as I said, try to be something that you're not, or something that just sort of feels, and I think that was without going into the detail, the way we did that was very different to anything they'd ever done before. And again, it sort of communicated that authenticity and different approach.
Thanks, Shayne. Those were some really amazing insights. I think in the process of telling us about your memorable speech, you've probably given us a lot more tidbits about how we prepare ourselves and how we handle change, more importantly. That's quite a curveball you got from Mike, I must say.
Yeah.
In Toastmasters, we have something similar. Not that we do it the way Mike did it, but we have something called a stable topics, where you're put on the spot and suddenly given a topic, and you got to speak for about a good 1.5 to 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm sure these will be very important tips for us.
I think the other thing on that, can I just say something that I've noticed as well, and that's more of a press thing.
Sure.
I think one of the tricks there is, and I don't know what you talk about for 1.5 or 2 minutes, so I'm not being judgmental, but I notice a lot of, particularly business people, and you can learn an ability to waffle. Like you can actually pretty much train yourself to talk for 2 minutes on nonsense and say things that sound, reasonably coherent and actually even potentially intelligent. But actually, when you listen to them again, you think there was no substance there. And so I think this idea so I think where communication has really changed in my lifetime, and it is in my lifetime, particularly, and I'm talking about business leaders. In the past, 20, 30 years ago when I started, 30 years ago when I started work, CEOs, business leaders, chairmen, whoever it might be, were distant. It's a bit like politicians. Were distant people you might see once a year. Their way of communicating was very rehearsed. It was probably written down, and it was very managed. Yeah, and that's sort of much easier in many ways it's a one-way channel. In today's world, social media, invasive media, more openness culturally, all of those things, it's more likely to be conversational. It's more likely to be on the spot. It's more likely not to be rehearsed. And so you can spin your way through those things and survive them, but you actually have to develop a style about that's being authentic, which is actually about, and what you notice is, and you see it actually, it's really interesting to watch on TV or on the radio or any of these other things. There are certain people who speak who give honest answers, and that authenticity shines through, as opposed to the people who give you the politically astute answer by not actually answering the question. And so people have become much more cynical. The audiences today are much more sophisticated than they used to be as well. And so I think you need to find your own level of authenticity and your own way to be able to communicate that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shayne. The next question I have is, your work has taken you different places in the world. You have extensively worked in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, obviously. How has that impacted your leadership? How has that contributed to your style of leadership?
Well, I think it's like anything to do with diversity. It gives you an exposure to different people's cultures, ways of doing things. I think it makes you a little bit more thoughtful about and a bit more empathetic about audiences and those stakeholders. I mean, I think you just realize that people are, while there's lots of things that are in common, it goes back to that point about situational management and situational leadership, situational communication. You have to be really thoughtful about the audience and the kinds of people that you're dealing with, whether it's cultural, ethnic, religious, whatever it might be, different backgrounds, and you need to be able to communicate it in a way that resonates for them. So now you've got to be careful, because as I said, there's a conflict there with what I said about being authentic. You need to find the right cross points that says, I'm still authentic, but I'm communicating to you in a way that will be received. So, you know, you learn that. Well, I think it's like anything. It's like any sort of variation of experiences. It teaches you to be more considered and a bit more thoughtful about issues, and not take your perspectives or your way of communicating or even your language, for example. I'll give you a funny story. I was in Japan, not working there. I was in Japan when I was actually CFO, and I did this town hall with the ANZ staff, and I said, I was talking to them, like, you know, whenever you're going and talking to staff, they want to feel like they're doing a good job, and you want to, you know, give them, you know, appropriate and authentic compliments. So I was talking to them about the fact that, you know, while Japan is relatively small for ANZ, in many ways it's a model business, and, you know, because etc. So I thought that, you know, I thought it went well, and then I get, you know, the next day I hear from the country there that said, oh, the people were really upset. There was a lot of upset about your comments, and I was like, why? I thought I was being complimentary. They said, well, in Japan, what they heard when you said a model business, they thought you meant like a model, like a little model of a business, like a toy. So they heard that you thought they were a toy business. Yeah. Now you sit and go, wow, now that never occurred to me. So, you know, so now that's an extreme, but I'm just saying you learn, you gotta understand cultural norms and language and how people will receive certain information. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's an interesting and funny one indeed. So the next question is a bit more on the personal front.
Sure.
I think the past 6 months or 7 or however much, losing track of time, how long we have been in this COVID world. But on a personal front, how has that impacted you? How have you dealt with it? Is there any new skill, new hobby you have caught on?
So my wife and I we've talked about this quite a bit, actually. I mean, you know, it's interesting. So we've got a 15-year-old daughter. As I mentioned, I'm naturally an introvert. So I don't, you know, to me, not going out doesn't impact me at all. Like I don't find it that difficult. So the idea, you can't go to a cafe or a restaurant or anything like that, I really couldn't care less. So I haven't been impacted by any of those things. I mean, my personal, and you know, and being at home, again, that would be my preference. So you know, weekends at home for me, like staying at home and pottering around in the garden and doing things with my daughter, and that's my choice. So I don't see any of that as a hardship. I think the hardship for me personally has been, it's actually not having something to look forward to, which is sort of holiday. So I think the personal travel, not being able to go on holiday, that to me has been that's really, and because of the uncertainty of it, it's not even like you said, well, look, so I'm a New Zealander, and we're very lucky we've got a house in New Zealand. So I'm not even sure we're going to be able to go to New Zealand for Christmas. But you know, so not being able to anchor in something, if I'd have known, hey, you be able to go there, that to me would help. Again, it goes to that point about certainty about things. When you're stressed and you're overwhelmed, you're just craving any sort of certainty. And so even knowing it's a long way off, but I know I can go to New Zealand and see, you know, and spend summer in Auckland at Christmas, that would have helped enormously. So I think having those things is really difficult. From a work point of view, the same. Actually, I learned that actually you can do your work at home and all that other stuff, but you realize how much you miss I miss it, despite I'm introverted and I don't seek all that out. You sort of miss the buzz of being in work and seeing people and, you know, walking past the coffee shops and all of that other sort of thing. So maybe it's the camaraderie of that piece. But that's what I've learned. I think it's, again, that sense of wanting, you know, that sense of, again, it goes, you know, having some sense of hope and being able to see it and put a date on it or a milestone would be I think that's why the second lockdown in Victoria has been so devastating for people.
Yeah.
Because it's not really like, and the so-called roadmap was so unclear and so confusing to people. It's made it really difficult to sort of focus on, well, if I do this for a period of time, there's some sort of reward.
Absolutely. So Shayne, but anything on the hobby front? For example, for me, you know, my hobby was I started growing a beard.
Not really. I mean, I did make that video. For some of you at the bank will have seen I made a video about what to do on your time off, which included growing a beard. I usually give up on the beard growing about 5 days. It gets too scratchy. We have a new puppy, so we've got a new puppy. I like reading, so I've actually used the time to sort of go back to reading a lot. And also, you know, trying to keep fit. So, you know, my wife and I we used to have a personal trainer that we would go to their gym, but now we've replaced that with Zoom training. So I've got one tomorrow morning at 5:30. So I do that a couple of times a week. So we just do it over the phone, and he Zoom trains in. I don't have a gym at home, but we bought some basic equipment. So we both sort of doubled down on that to, again, something to look forward to, not that I look forward to exercising all the time, but something to sort of have in your diary and feel like you're doing something positive. Those are the things that we've done. And, you know, and the good news is you know, again, in terms of being optimistic, it's almost summer. And so, you know, hope not today, but hopefully the weather will start to get better soon as well.
Well, it's Melbourne, so this is as good as summer can be.
Yes,
probably.
That's true. True.
Going back to probably just one more question on how to prepare ourselves for scenarios. How would you advise that we, you know, control our nerves? You know, there is always a certain level of nervousness, anxiety when we are at some important juncture. Any tips on how to calm yourself down, how to control your nerves?
Well, you should be nervous. I mean, I think, you know, this idea that I shouldn't be nervous, you should be nervous. I mean, you know, actually, we did some work with a group out of the US, this Neuro Leadership Institute, which does about, you know, brain behavior and all that. And actually, human performance is better at low levels of stress than none. Now, that's true whether you're a sports person, whether you're at work, whether anything. You know, you actually, under small amounts of stress, being a bit nervous, you actually focus more. Your brain actually focuses more and you get things done and you're much more efficient. The problem is when it becomes debilitating. When it goes too far, it goes to an extreme where you completely shut down because your brain basically gets so overwhelmed and so scared. What do? You protect. That's the only thing you do. So you just protect yourself by shutting your brain shuts down. So obviously you don't want to go too far. I mean, I think my sense of it is to keep reminding myself that, so first of all, practice makes perfect. It's true. The more times you expose yourself to slightly bigger groups, slightly more awkward situations, slightly unusual events, the more you get used to it. It's sort of like an exposure issue. You almost become immune. If you use the sort of COVID name, you build your immunity. And so I would say just slowly, baby steps. Hey, I spoke at with 5 people and it was 10, and then I did something on a stage, and then I did something recorded, I don't know, but, you know, sort of building your immunity. And then the other point is just to remind yourself it's not that serious. I mean, you know, at some point you also have to say, look, what's the worst that could happen here? And if you can kind of keep that level of authenticity, I think when people get really nervous is when they know they're sort of, they're winging it or they're not really being honest. Because if you're being honest with your answers and you're speaking what you actually believe, well, what can go wrong? And as long as people go, well, that was that person's opinion. They communicated it well. I listened. I thought it was authentic. It's always the fear of, oh, well, they don't sound authentic. They sound like they were making it up, you know. So I think you've got to build your immunity. Remind yourself it's not that serious. Like, it's only speaking. And then, you know, I think being clear to yourself, hey, I was honest. I gave an honest shot. It was what I believed. There was an authentic message there. I think that diminishes the risk enormously.
Awesome, and I think that's
probably and not to do what other people do. I think the other point is not to do what's expected. I mean, I think you got to be careful, because I know that in in many cases you're talking about set pieces, you know, standing up and giving a speech or something. And I think that's where my opinion, that's where some of the times it gets a little bit hard, because you're trying to do something that's not natural to you. And I'm not saying you can't learn new things. I'm not saying you shouldn't try new things, but it has to be authentic. And as long as you do that, then I think you can pretty much get away with anything. And people will read that what you did was authentic and true to who you are. So I think the risk is much lower.
And I think that's probably the best message we could get as Toastmasters, because this is a forum for public speaking. And most of us who came in here were so nervous that we couldn't get up on the stage to utter a single word.
Yeah.
And that's where the 1.5 minutes that I talked to you about suddenly feels like hours when you're standing there. But I think this is just a perfect message for us, that just be authentic, and a little bit of nervousness is good.
Yeah, you know, there's a, you know, the other thing is, and again, I don't want to sort of be preachy, but depending on the audience, and it does depend. Remember, most people are sitting in the audience generally thinking, God, I'm glad I don't have to do that. Right? So it's not like they're hostile. Most people are sitting there going, oh, I couldn't do that. I'd be really nervous. And so most people, audiences actually generally are incredibly generous and give you will absolutely give you the benefit of the doubt. And they don't mind if you stammer, and they don't mind if you trip over and you drop your notes, and if you make a mistake and you have to repeat something. It's okay. I think actually sometimes we get a little bit worked up that they're all seeking perfection. They're not, actually. It's not my experience anyway. And in fact, a little bit of sort of frailty, a little bit of mistake, or not, misspeaking and having to correct, it's actually just real. And people actually go, oh, well, this person's normal. I think, this idea to be too polished, too perfect is not authentic in today's world. In today's world, where people are used to homemade videos, they're used to sort of off-the-cuff podcasts, they're used to sort of, what do they call them? The sort of interrupted media interviews, etc. People are used to real. They don't like overproduced things. They become quite cynical about that. So I think again, you can manage that quite well.
There's another question, again, going back to, probably this is a bit more for all of us ANZers who have seen you through the internal webcasts and through all the video chats and sessions that we see. You deal and talk to a diverse set of people on a daily basis, sometimes ranging from, sports stars at one end to our customers, to leaders. And then sometimes you talk to us as internal staff as well. In all of these meetings, it clearly comes out that you're so kind of well prepared on the topic. And second is, you also come across as somebody who understands what is happening. You're empathetic in a way. So I'm just joining this with another end. One talk with your EA, and I know that your calendar is back to back to back. How do you usually prepare yourself for all this? And how does one prepare oneself for a situation like this?
Well, the dirty secret is that I don't necessarily over-prepare for a lot of those things. I mean, I think it's interesting that that's what comes across. I mean, I got asked the other day about this in particular with people, like, particularly if I'm interviewing somebody, and I mean, like, like on something, if you've called into those podcasts we do, where I'm speaking to a customer, or the other day it was, Todd Woodbridge, the tennis player, and I'm talking to him about whatever. Actually, I don't really prepare a whole lot. I think the point there is, again, is to be authentic. And that is, if you're not interested in the person or the subject, everybody will see through that. And there's no amount of preparation that can hide that. So you have to be genuinely interested. And, I think that level of curiosity and actually being really interested in the questions you're asking or the topic that you're giving a speech on comes through. If you're passionate about it, you're interested, or you're just doing it to fill in time because somebody asked you to do it, people can see that. So I think it goes back to that level of authenticity. If you communicate, hey, I'm really interested in this person that I'm speaking to. I'm actually listening to what they're saying. I'm interested in what their answer is. I'm going to probe further. If I just read a bunch of questions to them, and irrespective of what they say, I move on to the next question, it looks disinterested. It doesn't look authentic. And it clearly communicates that, A, I'm not listening and I'm not actually interested in what they're saying. So by the way, it's the same thing in writing, even if you're writing a speech. So I write my own speeches for investor presentations, at the year end when we do the CEO. Now I get help, don't get me wrong, I'm lucky. Somebody will help do the what they call a wireframe. Hey, what are the subjects we want to cover? And they might even draft something, but I generally rewrite everything because it has to be in my voice. It has to be the way that I would say it, and I have to talk about the things that I'm interested in. And then I think it's not so much preparation. It's just you're communicating an authentic interest in the subject. Yeah. So that to me is the way to do it. I mean, part of the problem is, part of the challenge of this job, I do get to meet amazing people, and I do get nervous about that because I'm like, why on earth would they want to speak to me? But I try to again go back to some name dropping. So next Friday, I think it's next Friday, I'm actually interviewing Steve Wozniak. Now, for those of you who remember, Steve Wozniak was the co-founder of Apple with Steve Jobs. Now I'm doing a video like this with him, which we're recording, which we're using at a conference that ANZ is running, talking about technology, obviously. And I'm really quite nervous about that. But rather than get over prepared for it, which I think will be a disaster, my approach is to literally just think about, well, what are all the, again, put yourself in the shoes of the audience. The audience is going to be about 1,000 corporate treasurers across Asia Pacific. What will they be? What would they want to know? And, and I think also the other point there is to go down the unexpected routes, not to ask always the expected questions, but the things that you're genuinely interested in. And I think if you sort of back your own judgment, hey, if I'm interested in these things, there's probably lots of people in the audience interested in that thing as well. That would be so I don't think it is about over prepared, but I think it's about showing genuine interest in the subject.
Thank you, Shayne. And I think from our side, we could just continue going on and on and on. But talking to you, we did not even realize that we started with 15 minutes.
Oh, that's all right.
And it's
Sorry.
almost been close to 45 minutes.
Well, I bang on a bit. Sorry. Just to finish up, I did actually come to there was a Toastmaster. I don't know if it's your chapter or another one, but I did come to one some years ago, actually, when I was in Insto, when they used to have the meetings at 100 Queen Street.
100 Queens.
So I was sort of aware a little bit of the history, which is a great thing. It's a really good idea. And I think my only advice is, as I said, it is like any of these things in life. It's a bit like a growth mindset problem. You just have to expose yourself to more things and try and learn. And I think the more variation you have in terms of subjects, audiences, approach, whether it's on video, radio, standing at a lectern, sitting on the couch, whatever it might be, the better you become at these things. I also, what I didn't mention, and I used to do it more, and I probably should do it again now, I really, really think this idea of a sort of a post-mortem is really important, which is to, after any of these things, to actually spend, it doesn't have to be long, a few minutes, just saying, hey, if I was to do that again, what would I have done differently? And what would I do the same? What in my mind went, hey, that went really well. I think consciously doing a bit of a retro and in your mind listening, hey, these things went really well. That story I told, that way I introduced that subject, the way I used the slide, whatever it might be. Hey, they were really good. I must remember that. And by the way, that didn't really work so well. I spoke too fast or I didn't get my point across on something. I used an analogy and nobody understood it, whatever. I think having a little bit of a retro, because I think it then fixes in your mind for next time. So seeing them as learning opportunities. But anyway, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thanks for the good questions. And good luck to you all.
It's our pleasure, Shayne. Again, as I said, we could take this for an next hour as well, but I think it's your time that is far more valuable.
That's all right.
It's a contest day today for us. So we have our speech.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I've taken up your time. You go ahead.
No. Where I'm coming from is I think these tips, hopefully the contestants can take away from this and just try to be our own self today. Just be authentic.
Well, good luck. All right. We'll see you all again. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shayne.